Thanks very much. I too will commence my lecture to you this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land here in Townsville, the Bindal and the Walgorukaba peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to their culture and customs as traditional custodians of this land. It's good to be here in this country. I'd also like to thank the University, the College of Business, Law and Governance, and also the James Cook University Law Student Society for inviting me to present this lecture tonight and to speak to you all this evening. And I thank you all for coming here to attend in person or those who are live streaming the event online. And I hope that what I have to say tonight won't be simply a repetition of what's been said in introduction. Some of it will be, but there might be a few more details. It is an honour and a privilege to give this annual lecture in honour of the late Mrs. Marilyn Mayo. And I'm especially honoured to join such a select company of those who previously presented this lecture to JCU law students. Past presenters have included distinguished High Court and Supreme Court judges, eminent legal academics and renowned scholars. And the various topics of the past Mayo lectures that have been delivered by these presenters have ranged across diverse subjects, but they have always undoubtedly been of interest to those studying law at JCU and aspiring one day to practice as lawyers. In each case, I'm sure those presentations have informed, entertained, and inspired those who have been in attendance. I hope to achieve at least some of those things this evening. Unlike many past Mayo lectures that have been delivered, my lecture this evening will not be in the form of a legal treatise or an academic analysis of substantive law on a topical legal issue. It was suggested to me that I might speak to you about my own journey in the law, from where I started through to where I am today. So, embracing that suggestion, my lecture this evening will be presented as a personal reflection on my own experiences from studying law and progressing in a career within the legal profession. In addition to that being a suggested topic for the lecture, one reason for taking this approach is that whilst I've joined a select group of esteemed speakers who presented the Mayo lecture in the past, I am uniquely qualified to present this lecture from a perspective that none of my predecessors have possessed. I grew up in North Queensland. I studied law here. I'm a proud graduate of the JCU Law School, and more importantly, I was taught by Marilyn Mayo. Now, before I speak to you about my own particular journey in the law, let me start by saying some more things about the late Mrs. Marilyn Mayo. Some of these things have already been mentioned, and not only tonight, but in previous presentations, and are well documented. Although Mrs. Mayo was born and raised in New Zealand, she was instrumental in establishing the law school here at James Cook University. Throughout her life, she was a lawyer, an academic, an active member of the broader Townsville community, and a patron of the arts. But above all, she was a great teacher. Marilyn graduated from the University of Auckland in New Zealand with bachelor degrees in law and arts. At the time, she was one of a small group of less than about 24 female law graduates from the university in the 1960s. After graduating, she was admitted as a barrister and a solicitor of the Supreme Court of New Zealand. She then worked in private practice before joining the Ministry of Works as Auckland District Solicitor. In 1969, she moved to Townsville to take up a position lecturing in law at what was then the University of Queensland's Townsville University College. A year later, the University College officially became James Cook University of North Queensland after the enactment of the James Cook University of North Queensland Act of 1970. It was during this period of time that Marilyn met and later married her husband, Dr. John Mayo, who was then a lecturer in economics at James Cook. At that time, there was no law school. There was no Bachelor of Laws course available at JCU. A College of Business, Law and Governance was not even a distant dream. Marilyn Mayo taught subjects within the Department of History. Students could complete their first year of a law degree at JCU, but if they wished to obtain their full degree, they had to relocate to the University of Queensland in Brisbane, or even further afield to one of the other universities offering law, such as University of Sydney, or even further south to the University of Melbourne. Now, this was most undesirable for any North Queenslander, and it was a deficient state of affairs that Marilyn Mayo worked hard to rectify for many years. As time passed, more law subjects became available to JCU students. Eventually, with the encouragement, support and advocacy of various others, including the late Sir George Knight, former Judge of the Supreme Court of Queensland and JCU's Chancellor, Marilyn finally succeeded in establishing the Department of Law at James Cook University and the offering of a full law degree in 1989. Marilyn was appointed as the foundation head of the School of Law and was its acting dean until 1990, after which she was replaced by her colleague, Professor Kenneth Sutton. Marilyn continued as an associate professor lecturing and held the position of deputy dean until 1993. She then retired from academic life in 1996, but nevertheless retained a keen interest in the teaching of law and no doubt in the affairs at James Cook University. As you all know, this lecture, it's an annual event run by the College of Business, Law and Governance in conjunction with the James Cook University Law Student Society in honour of Mrs. Marilyn Mayo. The Law Student Society instituted this lecture in 1991 as a tribute to the work of Mrs. Mayo in maintaining a law presence at JCU and ultimately in establishing the full law degree here. Now, although there's no formal stated criteria or terms of reference governing the subject matter for the annual Mayo lecture, I think its purpose and focus are self-evident. This lecture serves to honour Marilyn Mayo and the outstanding instrumental contribution that she made to this university and the establishment and development of the JCU Law School. It also serves as an occasion to honour the JCU Law School itself, that has grown in size and stature over the years to become a respected institution that produces graduates who are capable of excelling in the legal profession and in the wider field of the law. As a first-year law student in 1991, I'm pretty sure I attended the inaugural Mayo lecture. I'm not certain, but I think I was there. It was presented by the then Attorney General, the Honourable Dean Wells. If I did attend, I cannot now recall the subject of the lecture, but I do recall being impressed that JCU Law School was able to secure such a distinguished speaker to present that very first lecture, and that tradition has continued thereafter. Now, I would like to talk about my own personal recollections of studying law at JCU, being taught by Marilyn Mayo. And of course, after that, course of my legal career following graduation. As I recall these matters, I hope you will forgive me if some of the details are a little hazy or not quite accurate, and please forgive me for reminiscing. I grew up in my father's hometown, Charters Towers. When I was at school, every few months, my father would drive my brother and I 130 kilometres or so up to the Big Smoke of Townsville, where we go to visit family or go to the shops. Now, for my brother and I, our preferred destination back then wasn't Stockland Plaza at Aikenvale, it was the Flinders Street Mall. The mall was already in decline by then, but for us, it was the best place to go. It had dozens of specialty shops, Angus Smith Sports Store, foot-long hot dogs from the Cat and Fiddle Arcade, were some of our favourite things when we were younger. And then when I was a bit older, Playtime Clothing Store. The mall even had a David Jones department store. It was also close to our other favourite places to go in the city, the music store in the old T&G building, Time Zone video game arcade, and the Twin Cinemas. We could easily spend the whole day in the centre of the city before we had to make the drive over the Mingala Range and across the Burdekin and back home. Because my father was in the army when I was growing up, I had been to Laveret Barracks several times, but I'd never ventured out to Douglas. The only way to get there then, of course, was to drive along the long road past Laveret and on the other side past the new Annandale housing estate that was being developed, and then onto Angus Smith Drive up to the university. There was no ring road. In 1990, when I finished my senior certificate and graduated from Charters Towers State High School, I had no idea what I was going to do for a job. I did plan on undertaking some form of tertiary education, but I had little idea about what course I should do. Law was not really at the forefront of my mind. There had been no legal studies course at my school. I had no connection to the legal profession, and I knew very little about the law. I had applied to get into university, but my QTAC selections showed that I really did not have a clue on what I wanted to do. My 6 choices were spread as wide as possible to give me the best chance of getting into something somewhere. I selected law at JCU as my first option, but after that, it was business, nursing, psychology, and education at Central Queensland Uni, QUT, and UQ. As with many others who end up in the law, my initial choices and my choice to do law was guided more by wanting to avoid anything to do with mathematics rather than a burning desire to become a lawyer. The wait to find out what course, if any, I would get into had 2 stages. First, I had to wait for my tertiary entrance TE score to arrive in the mail. I thought I had done well enough to get into law, but even when my score finally arrived and I had what seemed like a good enough mark to qualify, it was still not a sure thing. The next thing was I had to wait for confirmation of the course that I would be offered, which would be published in the newspaper. I recall the day it came, my father waking me early by calling out, "You got into your course." I was relieved, but still a little unsure about what course he meant. It was only later when I checked the newspaper myself that I saw that I'd been offered a place to study law at JCU to commence at the start of the academic year, semester 1, 1991. That was, of course, the first year that students at JCU were able to study the full Bachelor of Laws degree course subjects. Second year subjects had been introduced in 1989 when the law school was established. Third year subjects were added the year after in 1990. The fourth year subjects followed in 1991, just in time for me to be able to commence a course that I could complete from start to finish without having to relocate somewhere else to graduate. So at the beginning of that year, I prepared to start my first year at university in Townsville. First thing to do was to find somewhere to live. A handful of others, I think there were about 8 in total from my school, were also going to JCU to study, but none of them were doing law. In fact, I think I was the only one from any school in Charters Towers who was doing law that year. There might have been one other at some stage, but I didn't know who that was. A few from my school had applied for and had obtained accommodation at University Hall. A few others went to Western Halls of Residence. A couple went to St Mark's and 1 or 2 went to John Flint College. It was only when the start of the academic year loomed closer and I still didn't have anywhere to stay that I put in a late application for Uni Hall. I didn't get in. It may have been due to the fact that it was a bit rushed and the only passport-style headshot that I had to submit was of me scowling and sporting a resplendent mullet hairdo. It looked more like a mugshot. Fortunately, I had a cousin who lived over at West End. He had a spare room and said I could stay there. So a week before the start of the first term, I packed all my gear into the back of my father's ute and we drove to Townsville. That would later become a regular ritual as I went back home for the holidays at the end of each year and would then return again the following year, packing up and heading back to Townsville for the start of the next academic year. Once I first got to Townsville and had moved into my cousin's place, the next most important thing to sort out was how I was going to get to uni from West End. I did not have a car or a driver's license, and I certainly did not have money for the bus. But I did have a bike. Once the first semester of my first year commenced, my regular commute each day was to ride from West End, along Dalrymple Road, up Nathan Street, and just follow it all the way along out to Douglas and the JCU campus. It was about 12 kilometres one way. Sometimes, depending on how my timetable was spread, I went out and back in the morning and then did it again in the afternoon. In the Townsville humidity, that novelty soon wore off. I seemed to be spending more time riding my bike than studying. And so in the second half of the year, I again asked if there was any vacancies at Uni Hall, and I applied for a room. This time, I was able to add that there were several other residents that I knew who were already living there, and I could trade on their good character and reputation. I got in. Once I moved to University Hall, things then became a lot different for me. Everything was now close at hand. My classes were usually only a few minutes walk away, except for the occasional classes that we had over in the education lecture theatres over at Western. I was able to spend more time studying though, and I could immerse myself in university life. In terms of studying, I'd always had enough self-motivation to do what needed to be done. However, the problem was when I first arrived at JCU, I didn't really know much about what needed to be done. In particular, I did not know how to write an academic assignment in the style and to the standard required for university. Fortunately, I had another cousin, an older cousin at the time who was studying second year sociology at JCU. I met up with him and he sat down with me one evening and showed me the basics of how to structure an assignment, stressing the importance of making sure that it was fully and properly referenced in Harvard author date style. Now that worked fine for the art subjects that I was required to take in first year, but was not so good when it came to my law subjects. If there was something like the Australian Guide to Legal Citation available at the time, I was certainly not aware of it. And I cannot recall now how I picked up the necessary knowledge and skills for legal citation and writing law assignments, but it was not through my cousin. It might have been through fellow law students. I also did not have much of an idea at the time about the legal system and the law when I started studying first year law student. That soon changed, and in large measure, that was due to the teaching of Marilyn Mayo. As a first year student, my introduction to understanding the legal system and the theory and philosophy of the law came from Professor Mayo's lectures in the subject LA 1002, Elements of Law. I vividly remember sitting in those lectures, listening to Marilyn as she talked and taught us about John Stuart Mill's principle of liberty and of Benthamite utilitarianism, and how she outlined for us in great detail the history and development of the common law and showed us the methodology for case analysis using the acronym FIRAC, Facts, Issues, Rules, Application and Conclusion, which I still use today and have used throughout my entire legal career. It was fascinating, and all the more so because of Marilyn's enthusiasm and her energetic instruction. She was a formidable woman and a great teacher. She was always clear and comprehensive in her tutelage. She was also always immaculately dressed and presented. She always projected an energy and passion for the law that inspired her students. I remember one particularly inspiring moment during an early Elements of Law lecture. It may even have been my first lecture. There were perhaps 130 students in the class that year. I didn't know a single one of them. Professor Mayo was discussing the road ahead and impressing upon us the importance of attending to our lectures and tutorials and dedicating enough time to our studies. This seems similar to the introductions given by other lecturers in other courses in my first year. But then she said something that really struck me and brought home the need to work hard. It was something like, look around the room. Only one out of every three of you will make it through this course to graduate at the end. I looked around. I didn't know any of the other people in my class, nor how I might compare against them in terms of my abilities or my aptitude for studying law. But I distinctly remember vowing then that I would be one of those who would be there at the end. And to make sure of that, I decided it would be necessary to develop some disciplined study habits and to stick to them. I devised a regular schedule and it worked. I recall at the start of the course being overwhelmed by the amount of required reading, let alone the additional recommended reading for every subject. It seemed there was far too much to learn and absorb, and there was simply not enough time in the day to read everything on the list. I thought the only way I could have any hope to get through it all was to consistently spend significant blocks of time in the library working through the required reading list. So that's what I did. In those days, cases were not available online on the internet. Everything had to be done manually. I would take the hard copy printed list of cases to the library. I would set myself up at a corral and stay there for half the day. I would then go and find the necessary volumes of the law reports on the library shelves, half a dozen or so at a time, and I would take them back to the corral where I would read the relevant cases. As I read the cases, I also made notes of them in the way that Marilyn Mayo had instructed. I would make them handwritten, each one on a separate filing card that I kept in a box for later review so I could test myself. And I kept the box on the desk in my room, and I would periodically pull out a card, test myself on the details of the case. This was a very time-consuming process, and in comparison with the relative ease with which electronic legal research can be done these days, not very efficient. But that was how things had to be done. And it was those study sessions that really imbued me with the sense and understanding of the law and its rigours, and instilled in me the self-discipline and commitment that I later realised were essential for a successful career in the legal profession. I can still conjure the smell of the pages of those giant leather-bound tomes, and even today, if I was to open up one of those old volumes, I would be immediately transported back in time to the library, to those long sessions spent reading the cases, sifting the ratio decidendi from the obiter dicta, summarising the facts and key points from my study notes. This was pretty much how I went about my studies for the first year: lectures, tutorials, and library. Of course, in those days, there was really no other option other than to attend classes. There was no live streaming or recorded content available online. There was a very limited option that I'd heard of. It was apparently available only in a handful of cases if you were lucky, where if you'd missed a class because of illness or emergency, there was sometimes an audio recording of the lecture on a cassette tape hidden somewhere in the library. Now, because the law school was also newly established, most of the subsequent year's subjects after first year were only being taught for the first or second time ever. So there was no mystical set of tried and tested lecture notes compiled by previous year's students floating around that someone could take and use as a substitute for attending their classes in person. I'm sure that's still the case. After my first year, I refined my approach to studying and I worked a little smarter, or perhaps I found a few more shortcuts. But long library sessions remained a constant. In fact, they probably became longer when I realised that I could save a lot of money if I didn't buy the recommended textbooks for every subject, and I simply went to the library and used the books that were there already. That meant going to the library, reading the textbooks, and making my own handwritten notes of the relevant chapters. I would routinely do this for an entire morning or afternoon and found that I could be productive enough in half a day session each day. It only became a problem when we would have an open book exam, but that was not very often. In fact, I only recall two such exams, one for tax and one for civil procedure. These days, of course, the JCU Library is fittingly named the Eddie Koike Mabo Library in honour of Eddie Mabo, a Miriam man from the Torres Strait who has a close association with the university. And his name and cause is immortalised in Australian legal history by the High Court's decision in Mabo from Queensland No. 2, the landmark 1992 case that recognised native title and overturned the doctrine of terra nullius. I think at the time, the then Attorney General was the Honourable Dean Wells, but I'm sure that the subject matter of the first Mayo lecture was not about Queensland's opposition to Eddie's case and the rationale for that position. Back then, of course, everything was done without computers. It's not all that long ago, really, but throughout my entire time at JCU, I did not have a computer for compiling notes or doing research or writing assignments. All note-taking was handwritten, whether in class or in the library. That might be the case for some students still today, but how I wish I had an iPad or a Surface Pro back then. Researching was also mainly a manual task. As with the cases in the law reports, this involved finding the books or journals off the shelf, photocopying the relevant excerpts or articles, if I could afford it, taking the collecting findings away for further reading and analysis at a later time. Assignment writing would also have been much easier with a computer. I do remember submitting at least one or two handwritten assignments in my first year. They were barely legible and I didn't get a great mark. For the most part, though, I was able to type my assignments on an electric typewriter that I received as a birthday present from my father right before the start of my first year. It seemed like pretty cutting-edge technology at the time, It could even make corrections without the need for any correction tape or liquid paper. Still, it was slow and cumbersome task to research and write an assignment this way. And I never did get the hang of how to do footnotes with the typewriter, so they were always handwritten. There were, of course, computers that were available in the library for research. If I recall correctly, there were 4. If a student wanted to use them for researching, it was a simple process of writing your name down on the reservation list to book your hour-long slot at the next available date and time, and then coming back in a week or 2 when that slot arrived. I think it may have been possible sometimes to book a double session of 2 hours, but that was the absolute limit. Even a double session hardly proved enough time to get much done. These research computers were in high demand, not because you could access the internet and a world of relevant material by entering a few key search terms or with a few clicks of the mouse, but because you could load up by CD-ROM the relevant research databases to search for material. Ours were usually the AGIS or APOS databases. They made researching much easier, but even with this assistance, it was still necessary to find the physical journals or the items in the library, as they didn't provide access to any electronic copy. They were just an electronic index that could be searched. And of course, you would then need to do all the searching for what was relevant within your 1 hour slot on the computer, and then walk through the library to find those journals and items and work out if they actually were relevant. Often they weren't. Nowadays, all of this, of course, is available on a smartphone. Nobody had a mobile phone back then, certainly not any uni students. And that meant that not only was all information seeking and researching done manually, but if you arranged to meet anyone at a particular time and place on campus, say to do a group study session, you had to be there at that time. There's no way of letting anyone know that you're running a few minutes late or that the session had been cancelled. The other benefit of living on campus at University Hall was that I got to mix socially with other students, not just those who were studying law. The great thing about that was that I was exposed to other people's thoughts and ideas and their outlook on life. That too was part of the learning I took away from JCU. In my view, the opportunity to learn those type of things from other students, especially those from different places and different backgrounds to your own, and from those undertaking studies in different fields, is a great opportunity, and one which helps make you a better educated person and a more well-rounded person. And the great thing about JCU in that respect was that I did not have to move down south and away from home to a capital city to get that education. In my opinion, the importance of that kind of exposure to the ideas and beliefs of others cannot be underestimated for a young person fresh out of school. Whilst it's not part of the formal undergraduate education, in my view, it is an integral part of the formative early adult years for any young university student. A university campus is a melting pot for thoughts, ideas, and influences, and it's a place where students not only acquire knowledge through formal teaching, but also where their own beliefs, values, and attitudes are developed and shaped. I do hope that the availability and use of technology these days does not deprive students of the opportunity to experience that aspect of university education and life on campus. Whilst it may be convenient to live stream a presentation or watch a recorded lecture at your leisure from home, and in some cases is necessary, in my view, a student who undertakes all their studies that way is missing out on an essential aspect of their university education. Now, coincidentally, the person who was responsible for University Hall at the time that I was a resident there, and the person to whom I had to apply to secure a room, was Dr. John Mayo, Marilyn Mayo's husband. John Mayo was the warden of University Hall, a traditional formal title which makes it sound like something out of Game of Thrones. He and Marilyn actually lived at the time at the university, provided accommodation adjacent to the student blocks at University Hall, and they would be present in the dining hall on most days at mealtimes. Despite that, other than the initial meeting I had for my interview, which I had to undergo with Dr. Mayo upon my second successful attempt at applying for accommodation at Uni Hall, I didn't have much direct interaction at all with the warden. It would seem that from time to time he would be in the dining hall speaking to other students. I only occasionally had a brief exchange or greeting in passing. That was it. And although I didn't know him well, I knew that Dr. John Mayo had a reputation as a strict disciplinarian. and that served to ensure University Hall ran as an orderly institution for the most part. There was one occasion, however, when I risked being on the receiving end of the warden's discipline, and I claim it is in part due to what I've been taught by Marilyn Mayo. Now, whilst there were many benefits from living on campus at University Hall, it also had its detractions. The main one for many students, including myself, was the standard of the food served at dinner time. The rumour circulating at the time was that the residents at the facility out at Stewart's Creek enjoyed a better quality of food than we did. There have been many attempts to raise the issue, but, so I understood from fellow residents, the powers that be would not listen. My own growing indignation with this unsatisfactory state of affairs happened to coincide with my increased awareness of the importance of fundamental human rights and my emerging understanding of legal duties and obligations brought about by Marilyn Mayo's teaching. A little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. In my experience, it's not uncommon that budding lawyers feel empowered and emboldened by what they learn at law school, and they often try to put their specialised knowledge into practice as soon as possible. Now, I did not think for 1 minute there was any legal avenue available that could be pursued by the residents of University Hall to bring about appropriate relief. But I did think that we were being treated poorly and unfairly, and that if we collectively showed our outrage through some form of protest, we might be listened to, and that might bring about a change. So one dinner time, when we were served up something ghastly that was called beef something, but which bore little resemblance to meat, I decided enough was enough. I urged the residents that I knew and those around me to rally together in the dining hall, to follow my lead and show their disgust when returning their plates to the kitchen. The plan was simple. As we filed past the scraps bin, where we would usually scrape our plates clean before handing them back to the kitchen, we would instead drop our plates in the bin and walk out. As the instigator of this plan, I went first. I strode into the kitchen and with a flourish, raised my arm high for all to see and let my half-full plate fall straight in the bin. Everyone just stared. No one followed. The only thing that changed after that was whenever I could afford it, I spent any spare money that I had on 2-minute noodles. That way, I would at least have something to eat when the inedible was next served. Now, while it would not be entirely accurate to refer to Marilyn Mayo as a strict disciplinarian, she certainly expected her students to put in the necessary effort and to work hard. And if any student failed to meet those standards, Marilyn would, of course, be available to provide a helpful word of encouragement, or perhaps a reality check. A friend of mine who was one of Marilyn's students and in his 3rd year of studying law when I started, received the benefit of Marilyn's words of encouragement after he had failed yet again to pass a particular 1st or 2nd year subject. Marilyn called him into her office to have a chat. She spoke to him about his performance in the course. How was he finding the workload, the assignments and the exams? She then asked him what he wanted to do with his life. After giving an incomprehensible, rambling answer that perhaps did not inspire the confidence that Marilyn was looking for in a future JCU law graduate, Marilyn said to him, "Perhaps you'd enjoy a job working outdoors." That little pep talk had the desired effect. My friend eventually completed his law degree and graduated, but not from JCU. Although the JCU Law Department had been established a few years before I started, it was still very much in its infancy when I began my undergraduate studies. The offices of the law faculty were squeezed into small rooms at the back of the library, where there is now a student equity room as well as a study room. There were no dedicated lecture theatres or tutorial rooms for the law course. Lectures were held all over the campus, mainly in the humanities lecture theatres, but sometimes in the lecture theatres of the education department or even the engineering department. It was a similar situation for tutorials. We would sometimes have tutorials in the classrooms where nursing students were located. But the main tutorial room was the small windowless room at the back of the library near the then law faculty offices. That's now the room, which is the peer assistant study session room. In addition to attending for tutorials or to see the law faculty staff in that area on occasions, students would also crowd around that area at the back of the library, craning to find their names and marks when assignments or mid-semester assessments were posted on the notice board. I had a look today, the notice board is still there, the same one, but it's now there for the student equity notices. No doubt these descriptions of the early days of the JCU Law School make it seem quite rudimentary. It was. For a new school, it was very old school, but it was a beginning. And as the current facilities, faculty and student body attest, it grew and flourished. Things have certainly changed from when Marilyn Mayo taught here and when I was a first-year law student. But what has not changed is the opportunity that the JCU Law School provides to North Queenslanders to acquire the knowledge and skills that will enable them to succeed as practicing lawyers in the legal profession or in other professional capacities without having to move away from their homes, their communities and their families. In preparing the speech and reflecting on my own time at JCU in the early years of law school, I thought it would be interesting to see how the current law school promotes itself to prospective students. According to the description within the College of Business Law and Governance's pages on the university website, James Cook University produces multi-skilled, versatile and ethical graduates. Our aim is that graduates will have developed the knowledge, skills and attributes necessary to take their places in their chosen career path. Our degrees prepare people for the practice of law and also for work within and service to a broad range of sectors, including government, corporate, social change, law enforcement and community wellbeing. We seek to do that by imparting a strong appreciation both of the rule of law and the role of law in its social, economic, environmental and political contexts. It also says JCU Law graduates emerge as practitioners who are committed to lifelong learning, intellectual development and displaying exemplary personal, professional and ethical standards. They have an understanding of First Nations peoples, reconciliation, diversity and sustainability. They also have a sense of their place in the tropics and are charged with professional, community and environmental responsibility. They exhibit a willingness to lead and to contribute to the intellectual, cultural and social challenges of regional, national and international communities. You've probably heard those things before. While those words are perhaps written in a style that might be described as a modern form of mission statement or a marketing promotion, similar words could have been written about the very first graduates to emerge from the JCU Law School, and those were followed since. I think that's because studying a law degree at JCU has always imparted students and graduates with more than simply knowledge of the black letter law. I certainly know that a strong work ethic, passion for the law, together with the ability to analyse and think critically about legal issues, were central skills and attributes that I gained and developed from studying law at JCU. Even more so than the academic and theoretical knowledge of the law, those skills stood me in good stead when I commenced practice as a lawyer and helped me to succeed in the legal profession. The achievements of the law school's alumni, which I am one, also show that despite its humble beginnings, the JCU Law School has provided a solid education for those seeking to make a career as a practicing lawyer. In 2019, I was honoured to attend the law school's 30th anniversary celebrations here at Townsville, where I had the opportunity to reconnect with past classmates and to see and hear of the amazing achievements of JCU Law School alumni. Those of you who are studying today and wonder whether there's any truth in the law school's promotional statements need only look at the successes of the past graduates to see where they have gone and what they have achieved. I now want to talk to you about where my journey took me after I graduated. Now, I apologise in advance if this potted history does come across really as an annotated curriculum vitae. I didn't commence practicing as a lawyer as soon as I finished my law degree. In fact, when I was nearing the end of my final year studies, I was not sure that I wanted to practice law at all. I wasn't sure that there was actually a place for me in the legal profession. Because of that, I decided to do what some of my other friends were doing at the time. I signed up to sit the Commonwealth Public Service Graduate Entry Examination. That was the way to obtain a graduate position in the Commonwealth Public Service in a Commonwealth Government department at the time. And depending on how well you did on the test, you could be offered a place in the following year's intake of graduates for one or more Commonwealth Government agencies. The prime department that everyone hoped to be offered a place in was DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Everyone had dreams of being involved with international law at the United Nations or becoming a diplomat posted to an embassy in some exciting or exotic overseas location. Positions with other departments, such as the Department of Administrative Services, were less sought after. I did well enough to be offered graduate roles with the Department of Health and Family Services and with ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, and the Department of Administrative Services. I chose the Department of Health and Family Services and was due to start in the department's Brisbane office the following year. Of course, I still had to wait to make sure that I actually passed my final exams and would qualify to graduate. I did, and in early 1996, I moved to Brisbane to start my new role as a graduate with the department. Unfortunately, after spending everything I had packing up and travelling down to Brisbane and then finding a place to live, I couldn't afford to come back to Townsville for my graduation later that year. Instead, I received my degree in the mail, rolled up in a packing tube. After several months working for the Department of Brisbane, learning aged care and disability services and project delivery, I managed to secure a rotation to the head office in Canberra, where I would be able to work on policy, have the opportunity to advance to a junior managerial position with the Commonwealth Public Service. This sounded to me to be the most interesting area available within the department and something that could provide a stimulating career option. I was wrong. I enjoyed my time in Canberra working in the department, and I was eventually offered a project officer role at the end of the graduate year. But the longer I was there, the more I came to regret not choosing to become a practicing lawyer, particularly when I was told that I was going to be working in a finance section of the department. So I decided to make a change. I left and returned to Queensland, where I completed my remaining last requirements for admission to practice. On 17 November 1997, I was admitted as a solicitor of the Supreme Court of Queensland. A week later, I was back in Townsville, starting my first day as a solicitor with the Townsville and District's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Legal Service. So within days of my admission, I was in court for my first ever appearance. A bail application for a client who had been arrested and charged with serious offences after allegedly breaking into a house in the middle of the night and sexually assaulting a young girl. I remember that I was first told about the matter and that it would be my first case when I arrived at the office that morning, and one of the senior lawyers asked if I had seen the newspaper yet. When I replied no, he threw that day's copy of the bulletin down on the desk and said, "That's your client." On the front page, there was a photograph of a man, handcuffed, no shirt on, being bundled into the back of a paddy wagon. As it was my first ever appearance, I was already a bit nervous as I walked over to court for the bail application. Fortunately, though, any nervous sweating was quickly masked by the lather of perspiration that formed as I walked to court in my long-sleeved shirt and tie. Fortunately, no jacket. Even though it was a short distance from the court to the office, Townsville humidity always ensured that I would arrive at court drenched and I would then freeze in the air conditioning. When I finally got there, I went to the magistrate's court side of the complex and tried to find my matter. After several minutes of wandering around lost, I eventually asked one of the court staff if they knew which court my matter was in. They told me that it was to be heard in one of the Supreme Court complex buildings, courtrooms. When I asked why that was, they replied, "Oh, there's too many people interested in that matter for it to be over here." I began sweating again. I eventually found the courtroom, and after speaking with my client themselves to obtain his instructions, I applied for bail in front of a packed courtroom full of journalists, practitioners, and members of the public. He did not get bail. Although that was a disappointing but perhaps inevitable outcome, and it was a stressful start to my career as a lawyer, I knew then that this was what I wanted to do. Amongst the pressure and the nerves, I had experienced also the excitement and thrill that came from appearing as an advocate. Over the next year or so, I continued to appear as a solicitor advocate for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander clients of ATSILs in Townsville and the Townsville region, including regular circuit court trips to Palm Island by plane. It was during that time that some of the skills and habits I had developed studying at JCU came to the fore, especially resourcefulness and the ability to adapt and think laterally when working under pressure. Those things were particularly helpful when there could be anywhere up to 40 or even 50 matters to deal with, and when I would have about an hour between when the plane landed at Palm at around 8:30 a.m. and when court started at around 9:30 a.m. to read the material, find my clients, get instructions, and prepare what I would submit or argue on their behalf. After my first year or so of practice in Townsville, the legal service went through a restructure. Everyone lost their jobs and I was forced to move to Brisbane. Luckily, I was able to secure a similar position with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service in Brisbane. I stayed in that role for the next few years before deciding that I should try to expand my experience in practice as a lawyer. Now, this largely came about because of a silly warning that I had heard from several still relatively junior lawyers, but nonetheless, they had greater post-admission experience than I did. And it went something like this: whatever you do in your first 5 years of practice is what you'll end up doing for the rest of your career. Now, as I'd been practicing for about 3.5 years, I was worried. I decided I had better hurry up and get some more experience in another area of law. I think my reasoning at the time was that I needed to get some experience in civil litigation before I hit that 5-year mark. Otherwise, I risked being sentenced to remain as a criminal lawyer for the rest of my natural life. Rather than just moving to a new job, I decided to move to a new location altogether, Sydney. I applied for and obtained a position as a solicitor in a civil litigation team with the New South Wales Crown Solicitor's Office. My now wife, Jacinta, and I moved there at the start of 2001 with the idea that we would get a couple of years' experience down there and we would move back to Queensland. Our stay ended up being almost 9 years. My experience in Sydney didn't start out so great. Again, it was because of my first appearance in that jurisdiction. When I started at the Crown Solicitor's Office, I was yet to be admitted in New South Wales. I was, of course, admitted in Queensland and had applied for reciprocal admission down there, but I had to wait for the next admission date. Not long after I started, I was asked to appear at a busy call-over in the District Court, although for a fairly routine mention. The courtroom was again packed. The list judge was renowned for his acerbic wit and his efficient disposal of the list, and sometimes of practitioners who appeared before him. When my matter was called, I announced my appearance and sought leave to appear, explaining that I was admitted in Queensland and waiting my admission in New South Wales. The judge sneered, "Queensland? Is that somewhere I'm supposed to have heard of?" Eventually, Crown Solicitor's Office did provide me with great experience in running a civil litigation practice. And after 2 years, I'd even progressed to the position of senior solicitor. However, I ultimately wanted to be an advocate, to appear in court and present and argue cases. So I made the decision to go to the bar. Whilst it had been for some time a goal of mine to become a barrister, the decision to go to the bar was not an easy one to make. It would mean leaving a stable, secure, well-paid job where I was doing well and quickly progressing up the ranks to instead become a sole practitioner at the bottom of an extremely competitive field with no guaranteed income and no certainty of work. I was fortunate to have the support of my wife and a number of great mentors who encouraged me and helped me to take the plunge and make the transition. But first of all, I had to sit and pass the New South Wales Bar Association's bar exams. There were 3 exams, which all generally had to be taken in the same week, and candidates had to achieve a mark of at least 75% in each exam to pass. We were told that the failure rate was high, only a third would get through. This sounded ominously familiar. I could almost hear again the cautionary words of Marilyn Mayo. So I adopted a similar approach to studying for the exams, to that which I did when studying at JCU, working hard and consistently to make sure that I knew the material back to front. I was so determined to pass that I even took my study notes on my honeymoon. Coincidentally, there was another sombre anniversary this week of an event that occurred during this period. My wife and I went to Bali for our honeymoon, and on the 12th of October 2002, halfway through our planned stay, terrible bombings occurred at Kuta. We were lucky that we were not there that night, opted to stay in our hotel instead. Studying was put on hold while my wife, who was a journalist, switched to reporter mode to cover stories for News Limited. A few weeks later, after we'd returned, I sat the exams and I passed. I then commenced the bar practice course in February the following year. And 6 weeks later, I was practicing at the private bar in Sydney. My speciality was anything and everything. After all, I did now have experience in both criminal and civil. In my first few years at the bar, I had a mixed practice. About half of my briefs were in criminal matters and the other half in civil cases. Of the criminal matters, about half were to appear as defence counsel and the other half to appear as prosecutor. I got to do a bit of most things. The first year as a reader at the bar can be tough. Readers can sit in chambers waiting in vain for the telephone to ring or for someone to walk in with a paying brief. And unlike those who practice as solicitors, it's difficult to market yourself as a junior barrister when advertising is not permitted and work cannot be solicited. The best way of marketing yourself when you're starting out is to be seen by solicitors and others in court doing a competent job on your feet for your client. Now, that's of course hard to do when you're new, as you first need to be briefed to appear in court before anyone will have the opportunity to see you in court. I was lucky that after about 3 months in my first year at the bar, I was offered a brief to appear for the Commonwealth Crown as junior counsel to a senior barrister in my chambers in a long criminal trial that ran for several months. That pretty much funded my entire first year in practice. Even better, it got me into court and seen by others. It also allowed me to get to know several instructing solicitors from the Office of the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, who subsequently came to brief me to appear by myself in cases for the Crown. From this start, over time, I developed a specialist criminal practice, prosecuting for the Commonwealth DPP and defending cases for legal aid, the Aboriginal Legal Service, and the occasional private client. After a time, I was doing more and more cases for the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, so much so that they asked me to join their Sydney office as in-house counsel, performing the role of Crown Prosecutor. I accepted the offer and did this for the best part of the next 6 years, interspersed with a brief return stint to Queensland as a Principal Crown Prosecutor for the Queensland Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions at the Sunshine Coast. My wife and I eventually decided to relocate back to Queensland permanently. In 2010, I returned to the private bar in Brisbane, where I continued to specialise mainly in crime. Over the next 10 years or so, my practice continued to develop and became busier and busier. The cases I was doing seemed to get longer, harder, and more complex, but I always retained the passion, self-motivation, and dedication to succeed in practice. Often that meant working long hours late into the night, working interstate for extended periods, working on weekends, and sometimes missing out on family or social occasions. It's a difficult and ongoing struggle for all lawyers to strike the right work-life balance, particularly for those who practice as barristers. To my mind, the intellectual challenges of the law, the stimulation of the fascinating cases, the exhilaration of achieving a just result for clients, and the satisfaction of being a member of a respected collegiate profession provide the greatest rewards for those who choose to take on the role and responsibilities of practice within the legal profession, more so than monetary rewards. However, the rewards of practice are not always easily attained. The demands on time and on physical and mental energy and health can be great. It is important to stay grounded and to maintain perspective and to not lose sight of other more significant aspects of our lives. Life shouldn't be all about work. Again, I feel that these were lessons that I learned from my time at JCU. Perhaps it has something to do with starting out in the law by studying in the university's laid-back tropical setting. I have always been motivated to do well in my professional life. I have wanted to achieve things, not for the sake of winning accolades or satisfying vain ambitions, but simply because I wanted to take on the challenges of practicing law and do my job well. I always wanted to walk out of court thinking, regardless of the outcome, I had done the best job that I could do. That was my own personal professional standard. For the most part, I felt I met that standard, but it's difficult to know how you're performing and how you may compare with others when you practice as a lawyer. That's particularly the case for barristers. There are no performance reviews. No one provides you with constructive criticism. Feedback is rare. The best indicator that you're performing well is that you are being briefed and you are busy. Now, I was fortunate that that was the case for me. I did, however, receive the greatest recognition I could hope for as a barrister. In 2018, I took silk, being appointed as Queen's Counsel in and for the state of Queensland. That title, of course, has now recently been changed to become King's Counsel. The moment I found out I was to be appointed as silk was something I'll never forget. The process for appointment is long. Applicants must submit their applications in August each year, addressing various criteria and putting forward their claim to be recognised by the profession as a leader at the bar. all on the strength of their own assessment of their skills, abilities and experience, and ego. It's hard to know if and when to put your name forward for consideration. Your character and credentials are scrutinised by senior members of the profession, by the Bar Association, by judges, and ultimately by the Attorney General. The announcement of successful applicants takes place in November. It's a demanding and nerve-wracking process for everyone and can be particularly demoralising for unsuccessful applicants. After submitting my application in August 2018, I then had to endure the long wait to find out whether I was successful. That year, the announcement of the new silks was delayed for a week or so, and the wait was drawn out even further, and the precise timing of the announcement was uncertain. Successful applicants are usually notified in writing by the Bar Association just before the new silks are publicly announced. On the day I found out the fate of my application, I wasn't in Chambers. I was actually at a tennis lesson about to step onto the tennis court when I received a text message from my clerk notifying me that a letter had arrived from the Bar Association and that she would just leave it on my desk for when I came back tomorrow. I immediately rang her back and asked her to open the letter straight away and read it to me. She did, and very matter-of-factly read and told me that my application was successful and I was to be appointed as Queen's Counsel. I felt as though I'd been electrocuted. The sensation was euphoric and the moment was historic. I had achieved a personal and professional goal that I had sought to one day achieve from the very first time that I started in practice. And at the same time, I became the first ever Indigenous person to be appointed as King or Queen's Counsel in Queensland's history. When I later signed the Silks roll at the Supreme Court on the occasion of the new Silks announcing their appointments to the court, it was a proud but surreal moment. This formality and tradition, which had been going on for about 165 years, had never yet had an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person appointed to that role to be able to sign their name in the book. After my appointment as Queen's Counsel, my practice increased exponentially. The number of cases I was briefed in and the difficulty and complexity of those cases increased. Diversity and areas of law involved in those matters in which I was briefed also expanded. Just when I thought that my professional career had reached its peak, another opportunity came along. In May of this year, I was offered an appointment as a judge of the Supreme Court of Queensland. To one day become a judge had long been an aspiration of mine. I recall that even when studying law as a student, I fleetingly dreamed about it after attending a lecture delivered here at JCU by Sir George Knight, although I never really seriously contemplated that would be a real possibility. Even as I advanced within the profession and practice, I only ever seriously began to think of it as a possibility after I had taken silk. I had long considered that it would be the pinnacle of achievements in the law to be elevated to the bench, but when the offer of appointment came, the decision to take it was not an easy one to make at all. I was again faced with another quandary. Taking the appointment to the court would mean leaving behind something that I loved doing, being an advocate and practicing as a barrister, and at the time with a burgeoning silk practice that was growing every day. Ultimately, I decided the opportunity of an appointment to the court was simply one that I could not pass up. Whilst it meant that I would no longer experience the exhilaration and satisfaction that comes from performing the role of an advocate, I was convinced that the new role would provide even greater challenges and rewards. So I accepted the appointment. And on 13 June this year, I was sworn in as a judge of the Supreme Court of Queensland. According to the official count, I think I'm the 135th justice to serve on the court. However, the more important number was that I again achieved another remarkable and historic first. I became the first ever Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person to be appointed as a judge of a superior court in Australia. I never wanted to be the first, but I was so proud that I was. Although I'm still new to the role and have only been on the bench for about 4 months now, my expectations of the challenges and the rewards of the appointment have proven to be accurate. Whilst judges have a heavy responsibility and at times an onerous and unenviable duty that they must faithfully discharge, the rewards for performing that duty are great. It's a privilege to be a member of the judiciary serving on the highest court in our state. The nature of the work is demanding but diverse and stimulating. There is great satisfaction in performing one's judicial duties to determine a legal dispute or controversy fairly and wisely by dispensing justice according to law. And that is the challenge I now strive to meet each day and the new standard. Having achieved quite a few things in the course of my time practicing law, it gives me great pleasure and satisfaction to return here to JCU to have the opportunity to speak to students who are just starting out on their own journeys in the law. Many JCU law graduates have achieved success in their chosen careers, whether as practicing lawyers or in other roles, and they have set an example to follow. I am just one of them. I hope that by sharing the story of my own journey, current and future JCU law students will be encouraged to believe that when they graduate, they will leave here with all the knowledge and skills necessary to compete with graduates from any other institution and to practice and succeed in practice within the legal profession, if they so choose. It is a profession that requires lifelong learning to succeed. And for students who study at law at James Cook University, that learning starts at the law school Marilyn Mayo helped to establish. Thank you.